All right. We're going to jump into the JFK administration. We do need to have a little bit of background because to me, you need some context on where Kennedy is coming from to make sense of some of his policies. Um, I do JFK. I kind of break him up into a couple little things. This is going to be a very basic lecture, and then we will throw in some background when we get into the civil rights stuff in a completely separate lecture. So, prior to the Kennedy administration was the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower was a military guy. He came, and so was Kennedy. But Eisenhower was a general during World War II, and so he's going to see a lot of things differently than Kennedy did. Doesn't mean that all military people see things the same way. Kennedy comes from military experience. He has a different take on what's going down. But as we leave the Second World War, the big concern for both Democrats and Republicans in the United States are concerns over threats of communism. Everyone in the United States is seeing this idea that communism is going to spread and we need to do something to try to contain it. And from the Eisenhower perspective, he is going to approach this with this idea of massive retaliation. The United States is going to build up a tremendous amount of nuclear weapons. Kennedy does a little bit of the same thing, but the United States is going to build up a massive amount of nuclear weapons. And any time the Eisenhower ideology is that if there is a significant thrust by the Soviets and now by the Chinese, that the United States will answer that with a massive amount of nuclear weapons. And in that line, and we'll talk about that's problematic when Kennedy gets into power. Within that line, the United States is going to develop two different lines of nuclear weapons. We are going to develop both tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are designed to be used on the battlefield. So you're not going to use these nuclear weapons on cities or anything like that. You're going to be using them on, a tank battalion or something like that. So these are small nuclear weapons that are designed to be used on the battlefield. On the other side of that are strategic nuclear weapons. And these are the ones that we kind of think of when we talk about the Cold War. Strategic nuclear weapons are designed to level entire cities. And so the ones that the United States is developing in the 1980s, well, probably even before that, honestly, but we will get to the point where, a couple of these nuclear weapons could level Moscow. Large cities would just be completely destroyed. In a weird way, I find those less scary than tactical nuclear weapons. And my line of thinking is that there's a great reluctance to use any of these things. But there's a really great reluctance to use strategic nuclear weapons because you kind of know that you have entered a nuclear exchange. This different from World War II. World War II, the United States was the only party with nuclear weapons, but now we have multiple parties with nuclear weapons. And if you're using strategic nuclear weapons, you have entered definitely a nuclear exchange, and their weapons are going to be used on the United States. And so there's a really big hesitance to use these. There's also a hesitance to use tactical nuclear weapons, but we're putting the decision to use those weapons on the ground with troops on the ground. And that is a lot more scary, because today in the United States, only the president has the authority to use nuclear weapons. Well, with tactical nuclear weapons, you have to entrust soldiers on the ground to make the decision to use these or not. And if they use these, we've started a nuclear exchange, and you're probably going to build up from that. And that, to me, that's weirdly scary. Scarier than strategic. I don't know if that's rational, but I'm not rational sometimes. So, a couple of examples of these. One of the somewhat more interesting ones is an M65 Atomic Annie. And the Atomic Annie is kind of cool because, if I can find it in my notes real quick, the Atomic Annie fires a weapon with a 15 kiloton yield. We measure atomic weapons by how much is the equivalent of TNT. And Little Boy, the weapon dropped on Nagasaki, was a 15 kiloton yield. So this piece of artillery will fire a weapon that is the same yield as the weapon that was dropped on, Nagasaki. The United States deploys 20 of these. Some of them go to Europe to, block a potential Soviet invasion, and some of these go to South Korea in an effort to sort of stall a invasion from North Korea. So we're putting nuclear weapons that are the equivalent of the weapon used on Nagasaki in the hands of troops on the ground. And, troops on the ground are great, but if you're entrusting them to use a weapon like this, that's a little scary. What if you get somebody that's a little bit overeager? What if you get somebody that panics and uses one of these weapons? So you can easily start a nuclear exchange, from some Yahoo on the ground. Even scarier than that, and what's interesting to me about this one is the United States gets a little bit nervous about this, even though they developed it. This is the M28 Davy Crockett. This has a very small yield. It is a 5 megaton yield, kiloton yield, right? Kiloton? Yeah. I think it's a 5 kiloton yield, but the nuclear weapon on this is the size of a large watermelon. You can literally break this entire weapon system down, and there's pictures of it on there, in 5 different components, and a 5-man team can put this in, sort of backpack rigs and march this up to the front. This one is scary for a number of reasons. One, because holy cow, that's just kind of scary to be, giving that out. The other thing is the accuracy of it. It is only really, well, you can fire this thing. I think you can fire it out to a range of about 5 miles. And it's meant to stop incoming Soviet tank battalions. Here's the problem, though. If you've ever shot any kind of rifles, pistols, anything like that, you know that the farther out you try to shoot something, the less likely, because you're having to account for, if you go into extreme ranges, windage, you're having to account for gravity in some situations. I mean, it gets really, really difficult to reach really, really far out there accurately. Well, this has a range of like maybe 5 miles. I'm not really sure exactly. But that's at the extreme range of this. To be accurate in any way, you can't fire it that far. And I think the accuracy on this, and I could be remembering wrong, I think it's like 2 miles to be able to fire this accurately. Well, if you fire this weapon at something 2 miles away, you're very, very likely to irradiate your crew, the people that actually fired it. And so, this whole idea around this one is that the people on the ground are able to be sacrificed. And you kind of have to think that way militarily sometimes anyway. But this is definitely, if you assign this to a crew and expect them to fire with any kind of accuracy, you have to be willing to sacrifice them, which is kind of messed up. I get that we deal with military losses and stuff like that, but that's kind of. This one, though, is also interesting because the West Germans, right after World War II, we've broken Germany into West Germany and East Germany. The West Germans, the allies to the United States, absolutely loved this idea. They thought this was fantastic. Some of the West German higher ranking government officials wanted to really downsize their military quite a lot. Militaries are expensive. They wanted to downsize their military quite a lot and get a lot of these because that'll stop a Soviet invasion right there. You don't need that many of them. And they were so eager to get more of these than the United States really wanted to give them, that the United States was like, they're a little bit too eager for these. And so the United States actually dials these back. And that's saying something. Usually we're the ones that are, let's develop, increasingly lethal, weapon systems and stuff. And we're like, you're a little bit too happy about this. So, the United States actually dials this back and doesn't give the West Germans as many as they wanted on this system. Another one is interesting from a technological standpoint as well as a testing standpoint. Post-war United States. The United States Air Force develops the largest bomber that we have ever developed. This bomber is larger than a B-52, the B-36. It's really, I'm an airplane nerd a little bit. It's really, really cool because it comes at a time when we're transitioning away from propeller-driven aircraft into jet engines. And you see that on this aircraft. It has 6 propeller engines and it's got 4 jet engines. The problem, so we're developing missiles that can reach the Soviet Union. We're going to develop submarine delivered ballistic missiles that can reach the Soviet Union. And the Air Force is the third bit of the nuclear triad, that the Air Force wants to be able to deliver aircraft delivered nuclear weapons. And so this is going to be the next step in being able to deliver nuclear weapons to the Soviet Unions with bombers. That said, it takes an incredible amount of fuel to fly from the United States to the Soviet Union and then hopefully back, right? Because you want to get your pilot, your crew and your aircraft back, hopefully. Well, a way to get around the fuel issue, the aviation fuel issue, is what if we run this thing on nuclear power? What if we power an aircraft with nuclear energy? And so the Air Force decides to take a B-36 frame and adapt it so that we can use it as a nuclear test bed. And so this new designation is the NB-36, Nuclear Bomber 36. And they literally shoehorn an active nuclear reactor inside of this aircraft. Now, you don't have to get this down. They are not actually powering the aircraft just yet. This is just a test bed in an early stage. What they're trying to see is, do takeoffs and landings. If you've ever flown, you know that can be rough sometimes. Will takeoffs and landings cause problems for a working nuclear reactor, which is a very sensitive piece of equipment sometimes? Will turbulence cause problems for a working nuclear reactor? And so like I said, they shoehorn a working nuclear reactor into this aircraft, and then they've got to fly it. Where do they fly it? You would think that, what if this thing crashes? We probably want to fly it somewhere over some unpopulated area, like way out in Nevada or Montana or something like that. The NB-36 is based at Carswell Air Force Base, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. So for the year or two that this test bed is being tested, they are going to off and on orbit over in the airspace over Dallas-Fort Worth, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. So if this would have crashed, if there would have been some kind of problems and it would have went down, it would have went down in one of the most populated places in Texas, which it's just absolutely bonkers if you think about it. But the primary concern is the influence of the Soviet Union. And so we're willing to sacrifice a whole heck of a lot of common sense and safety in pursuit of thwarting the Soviet Union. But that particular aircraft is just kind of absolutely wild. So that's kind of Eisenhower's thing. Let's develop bigger, more lethal nuclear weapons that will thwart the Soviet Union. When Kennedy comes on the picture, he's going to take a different approach. And also, during this election, Kennedy's going to run against Nixon the first time. And a big thing is the Democratic Party is still in this state of flux. Remember, Northern Democrats and sort of national level Democrats are inching more liberal. Southern Democrats are still very, very socially conservative. And so Kennedy has to kind of walk this line of this party in transition. And one of the things that the Democratic Party is going to do is jump on board on tax cuts. Now, to be fair, in 1962, the top tax bracket, the richest of the rich, the Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk kind of people, the super Warren Buffett, super wealthy people are paying a 92% of their income to taxes. Now, when that happens, a lot of those people find ways to kind of get around the tax system and stuff. Wealthy people can hire lots and lots of accountants and do creative things. So they probably weren't actually paying that much. But still, by any measure, that's excessive. And so Kennedy is going to push for cutting the top tax brackets. He pushes for cutting all of the tax brackets, but the top tax brackets are paying the highest amount, and so we're going to cut those. And so it was 91% in 1962. It was 33 when I did this lecture, when I put this PowerPoint together. It's dropped since then. I think it's like 31% now. So the rich people need more money. They're struggling, and we need to help the rich people. So, but with it that high, tax cuts are going to result in more spending. So if you're at a 91% tax bracket and you get tax cuts, you're going to spend that money rather than sock it away. Today, if you cut tax brackets, let's say from 31% from the richest people down to 30%, they're just going to reinvest that. They're not really going to buy another Lamborghini or something. They've got 14 Lamborghinis. What do they need another one for? So it gets diminishing returns. And we're in the state today where we're very much in the diminishing returns. Tax brackets for the wealthy aren't going to do anything. So now here's the big departure. Eisenhower was thinking about, confronting the Soviet Union directly, confronting China directly. What about the developing world? That's where communism is expanding into Cuba expanding into Nicaragua, the smaller expanding into Indochina, which becomes Vietnam later. It probably wouldn't look cool for the United States to use a nuclear weapon on Cuba. We would look like the bad guys. It wouldn't look cool for us to use a nuclear weapon on Vietnam. We would look like the bad guys. These are very, very impoverished people struggling. And yes, if they go towards communism, that's really, really bad. But just to, nuke them is going to make us look like the bad guys. And so Kennedy sort of starts to see some nuance in confronting the Soviets. Yes, a direct confrontation might necessitate, that's a word, a nuclear response, but in the developing world, that would be a bad look. And so Kennedy is going to develop smaller scale responses, non-nuclear, conventional smaller scale responses. And so in the developing world where there's a military threat, the United States is going to build up the Green Berets. The Green Berets are a special forces unit. They are going to go in and teach the local population to confront communism themselves. So you've got small teams, and they're going to teach the local population how to be able to defend themselves militarily. This is called a force multiplier. Also, though, you've got engineers, not engineers the way we think of them kind of around Huntsville, but these are like combat engineers that know how to do construction and know how to dig wells and build bridges and stuff like that. And that can help the local population. Also in the Green Berets, you usually have a highly skilled medic. Well, those people can teach and treat the local population with medical issues and stuff like that. So you're teaching them how to defend themselves, but also you're doing sort of community service, for lack of a better kind of term. You're helping them to build stuff, develop the community, as well as look after medical issues and teaching them that kind of stuff. So you're generating goodwill. Similar thing, the Peace Corps. In places where you don't have a military conflict going on, but it is a impoverished country that is struggling, you send in the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps will have medics, they'll have doctors, they will have construction people, and you do the same thing without, teaching them how to defend themselves, but you help to develop the community and you help to build up these impoverished countries, and you're developing goodwill. So both the Green Berets and the Peace Corps are developing goodwill, so that when the time comes and those people have to make a choice, they might choose the United States instead of the communists, the Soviets, or the Chinese for assistance. They might like us better. And this is a big reason why foreign aid is so important. You're not just giving people money, you're developing those countries, and then you're developing allies later on. So foreign aid has a really big strategic factor in it. We're not just giving cash away. Now, one of the big early challenges in Kennedy's administration is Cuba. Before Eisenhower left office, so this is actually an Eisenhower plan. Lots of stuff transfer through presidents, but this is an Eisenhower plan. Before Eisenhower left office, Cuba had fallen to the communists. Fidel Castro is the leader of Cuba. And so the United States wants to get rid of this communist nation that is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Well, we don't want to invade directly because that will be pretty obvious that the United States is directly confronting the Soviets in Cuba. And so the United States organizes this idea. Down in Florida, there's a whole lot of Cuban expatriates, people that were born in Cuba, that lived in Cuba, that then fled when Cuba becomes a communist country. They fled and moved to Florida. So there's a big Cuban population down there in Florida. What we're going to do is the United States is going to train those people. We are going to outfit them militarily, and then we are going to help them to invade Cuba to try to overthrow Fidel Castro. And that's what was going on in the Eisenhower administration. Now, we can't just expect these guys to land on the beach and do this themselves. They're going to need artillery support. So naval artillery support. They don't have a navy. Stan's got a boat. That's not going to cut it. They're going to need close air support. They're going to need aircraft flying above, strafing, enemy opponents, and possibly bombing artillery support that those guys have. So they don't have an airplane. And so under the Eisenhower administration, these Cuban expatriates are going to land on the beach, and they are going to move inland and overthrow Fidel Castro. But the United States Navy is going to provide artillery support, and secretly the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, is going to fly close air support. Eisenhower is going to step away from the presidency at the end of his term, and Kennedy is going to inherit this plan. Well, Kennedy's new, Kennedy's inexperienced, Kennedy is not very sure of himself, especially some kind of major operation like this. And so Kennedy's going to go ahead with it. But really, unfortunately, at the last minute, when the Cuban expatriates from Florida are landing, getting ready to land on the beaches, Kennedy is going to call back the naval artillery support and almost all of the CIA close air support. I believe the way it worked is there are a couple of pilots with the CIA that elected to go on their own. And they're still going to fly their planes that the United States CIA owns, but there are a couple of pilots. But the naval artillery support's called back, and I'm thinking that's the way it works with those pilots. And so these guys storm the beaches at the Bay of Pigs, and they're just chewed up. They don't have any support. They're landing on the beach against the Cuban military that does have artillery and it does have aircraft, and the Bay of Pigs guys are just chewed up. And a couple of big things come out of this. One, this really solidifies the Cuban population that lives in Florida. They're really dedicated Republicans, and they're still dedicated Republicans. And so that population down in Florida very, very much still votes Republican. On the other side, also, though, the Soviets, that Kennedy guy, that young Kennedy guy that is inexperienced with his, fancy hair and stuff like that, he looks like he's really weak. And we could probably do what we want, and we can push him a whole lot because he's weak, he's a coward, he's not willing to confront, the bear in the east, the Soviet Union. And so you've sort of done two things. You've solidified the Cuban population in Florida down there for the Republican Party for generations. They're still very loyal Republicans. You've also, for right now, the Soviet Union sees Kennedy as extremely, extremely weak. So that will lead us to the next thing. Since Kennedy is seen as weak, the Soviets elect to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. So they have nuclear warheads on missiles in Cuba. This is holy cow scary, because if these launch, a second ago I said Cuba's 90 miles from Florida. If these launch, you don't have any warning in the United States. These are going to launch, they'll fly to the United States, and it's within a couple of minutes. If there's an incoming missile attack from the Soviet Union, especially later on as we get better at detecting these things, the United States would be able to have some warning. It may be 30 minutes, but you would have some kind of warning. And that's still not enough time to do anything or get anywhere. But these missiles, you could fire them at Washington, D.C., and you wouldn't know it until there's a mushroom cloud over the Capitol. So these have to be removed. And so during a little bit after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Soviets are going to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and these are detected by U-2 spy plane overflights. They're also detected by RF-8 Crusaders, but the U-2s kind of are the star of the show for some reason. And so there's a panic in Washington. Holy cow, these got to be removed. Yesterday, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the Air Force, the head of the Marines, the head of the Army, the head of the Navy, and I don't know if the Coast Guard was there that day, not to make fun of them, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff immediately recommend a beach invasion of Cuba. We need to put troops on the ground. We need to overthrow the Cuban government. We need to take control of these missiles absolutely directly with military force yesterday. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military advisors to the president, really recommend that. Kennedy doesn't want to do that. That seems really overly aggressive. And I'll get to why it's a bad idea in a second. Instead, Kennedy decides to go on a less super confrontational approach, and the United States Navy is going to deploy a fleet, and they are going to blockade Cuba. Cuba's an island nation, but man, they depend on a lot of resources being shipped in from the Soviet Union. And so Kennedy decides we are going to cut off Cuba, and we're not going to let anything in or out of Cuba. So they are not going to get any kind of fresh resupply or anything like that. And this blockade goes on for 2 weeks, and there are a couple of very serious heated confrontations between these merchant ships that are coming into Cuban waters. They're escorted a lot of times by Soviet naval ships, and it gets really, really heated, but thankfully no shots are exchanged. And eventually, through back channel communication, the Soviets decide to stand down. Now, this is two really cool things on this. Publicly, the United States says, hey, to our people, to the people of the United States and the Western world, hey, we got the Soviets to stand down. They are going to remove those missiles from Cuba. We won. Yay, cool. Now, on the Soviet side of things, to their people, and they're telling the truth, they're going to say, hey, we got the United States to remove nuclear-equipped Jupiter 2 missiles from Turkey. Turkey is very close to the Soviet Union, and the United States had deployed nuclear missiles to Turkey several years back. And so the Soviets are going to present this as a one-sided victory. We got the Americans to back down. And the Kennedy administration is going to present it as a one-sided victory. We got the Soviets to back down. And so that's really kind of funny that each side sort of portrays itself as the victor here completely. Now, the thing I told you a second ago, that it was a really good idea that Kennedy elected to go for a blockade, is because, like I said, the Joint Chiefs wanted to do an immediate invasion of Cuba. Well, the missile crews on the ground in Cuba, those guys that were manning those nuclear missiles there, had the authority that if they heard that there was any kind of a confrontation, if there was a beach invasion of Cuba, they are under standing orders to go ahead and launch those missiles. And so, if the Joint Chiefs would have gotten their way on this super aggressive kind of strategy that they were wanting to throw out there, we definitely would have had a nuclear exchange, and nuclear weapons would have been detonated in a military conflict against the United States. So sometimes it's good to take the less intense, less aggressive route there. Unfortunately, in 1963, Kennedy goes to Dallas, Texas. And while he is in Dallas, Texas, a lone assassin, there's just not any credence to the conspiracy that there were multiple gunmen, or that the CIA was involved, or that the mafia was involved, or anything like that. A lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, worked at the Dallas School Book Depository. The Dallas newspapers had published the Kennedy parade route a couple of days before, and Oswald wanted to shoot somebody. And he actually did try to, he actually shot him. No, he didn't hit him. He tried to shoot a former general that lived in Dallas a little bit before. He shot through the guy's front window. That guy was a hard-line anti-communist, and Oswald had a lot of sympathy toward communism. He even attempted to resettle in the Soviet Union for a time. He didn't quite like it and moved back to the United States, but even brought his Soviet wife with him to live in Dallas. Anyway, Oswald sits up at the School Book Depository. He has practiced shooting this bolt-action rifle of his for a very, very long time. The Kennedy limousine caravan thing is driving through Dallas really, really slow. It's a convertible. It has the top down. And Oswald takes a couple of shots, and he hits and kills Kennedy. There used to be this weird idea of a magic bullet because it looks like the bullet hit Kennedy and turned in midair and then hit Texas Governor Connally. It didn't. Governor Connolly's seat was actually a little bit to the inside of the car, and so the bullet does not turn. If you sit Connally and Kennedy in front of each other, it doesn't work. But it's a little fold down jump seat, and that's what Connally was sitting in, and he was sort of to the inboard of Kennedy, and so it flies through Kennedy and goes in a straight line through Connally. There's no weird conspiracy about this. One person shooting a rifle can hit another human being in a very slow moving car. So Kennedy is killed in 63. But in Dallas, after Kennedy is assassinated, his vice president is sworn in. And this is Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson is not, he uses a lot of racial language, unfortunately. This is 1963 though, but Johnson is very, very much equal rights. And a big thing with Lyndon Johnson is that when the president is assassinated in 1963, Johnson wants to honor the slain president. And over the last year or two, Kennedy had been really, really leaning into civil rights stuff. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But over the last year or so, Kennedy had been really leaning into civil rights stuff. And so Johnson is going to take that momentum and run with it. And so he's really, really going to push for a lot of civil rights legislation. One of my favorite things about Lyndon Johnson is that he's very, very crass. He will get in your face. He's very, very confrontational. And he does something called the Johnson treatment. He will start talking to somebody and he'll just keep getting closer and closer and closer until, and you can see it in this series of pictures, the other person he's talking to is just leaning back really, really uncomfortably until Johnson is just right up in their face. And he does this repeatedly. There's a series of pictures of him doing that. Here's another couple of pictures of him doing that. The picture of him, the full-length picture, where he's standing up with the gentleman and the guy's like leaning back on his back foot there, is fantastic because if you go to the Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, they have a cardboard cutout of Lyndon Johnson doing that. And so you can, I don't know if it costs anything, but you can stand in front of Lyndon Johnson and lean back and sort of mimic the Johnson treatment. All kinds of people have done this. There's one with the Easter Bunny getting the Johnson treatment. I've seen someone else dressed as Santa Claus getting the Johnson treatment. And so it's really fantastic, but he's really, really, holy cow, pushy in engaging in this. Something else with Lyndon Johnson is that before Kennedy was assassinated, in addition to starting to push for civil rights, the Soviets have started a space program. And so Kennedy at Rice University in Texas gives a speech. And in this speech, he says, and I'm just going to read it off the thing there, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. So Kennedy has made this very public challenge to NASA and the federal government that we need to land a person on the moon and then bring them back to Earth. We need to do that to beat the Soviets, to prove that, sort of democracy is going to win out over authoritarianism, capitalism, and free development of ideas is going to win out again over authoritarianism. And so he really, really puts this challenge out there. And a big thing that a lot of people yell about, and I think we should yell about this, but a lot of people yell about, why haven't we been back to the moon? In the 1970s, the United States was landing people on the moon, not on a regular basis, but quite a few people had landed on the moon during that time. What happened to all that? Like, why haven't we been back to the moon? And a big thing is budget. Now, granted, the budget of the federal government has gone up, since the 1960s and 70s. But in 1969, when NASA first landed human beings on the moon, the budget of NASA was 4.5% of the federal budget. We were just shoveling money at NASA. NASA had an incredible budget. They were able to develop a lot of really, really wonderful things and develop them very, very quickly and not have to worry about budget constraints so much. Today, or at least the last time I checked about this, and this was about a year or so ago, so it's probably even dropped since then. So remember, 1969, federal budget, NASA gets 4.5%. about today, and it may be lower, the current budget of NASA is 0.5% of the federal budget. They don't have any money. I mean, they've got some money, but they don't have anywhere near the budget that they had in the 1960s. And again, the federal budget has ballooned over the last several decades, but they don't have the budget that they used to have. And so that's a big reason why we haven't gone back to the moon. That's a big reason when the space shuttle program retired, we didn't build anything. Now, one last thing, and I do want you to go to YouTube and put in this song and give it a listen. But while NASA is developing these wonderful, wonderful things and this technology that benefits us all absolutely today, but while that's going on, in the 1960s and the 1970s and in the 1980s, there's a lot of poverty in the United States, especially in the inner cities. Because once we get rid of segregated schools, the cities are not segregated anymore and the school systems are not segregated. So what we have is something called white flight, where a lot of white folks, are going to abandon the cities, and because of the lack of jobs and racial restrictions and stuff on jobs, that leaves, a less affluent African American community. And so the cities don't really have a lot of the tax base that they used to have. And so a lot of people are struggling in the cities. And so there's a lot of pushback on, hey, NASA's cool, but we're spending a whole heck of a lot of money on sticking people on the moon when there's a lot of people here on Earth in the inner cities that are really, really struggling with basic needs like food. And so a fantastic artist from the 1960s and 70s is a guy named Gil Scott-Heron, and my head is covering up part of the song title, but he puts out a song called Whitey on the Moon. And this is really, really cool because it's a protest song. It's also sort of proto-rap. It's spoken word poetry, and it's got a beat to it that's backing it. It's not quite rap as we would think of it today, but it's kind of very early sort of precursors to rap music. But give a listen to Gil Scott-Heron's Whitey on the Moon and check out what he's addressing. That song likes to show up on my tests and some of the content of the song. So definitely do give it a listen. And with that, we will cut out, and the next lecture is going to be purely on civil rights.